A meal was never really over when the plates were empty. That was the part nobody explained out loud. In a Depression-era kitchen, you could sit at the table, eat everything that was put in front of you, thank your mother, push your chair back, and the meal would still not be finished. Because sitting right there, on the edge of an empty plate, was the part almost nobody in a modern kitchen even looks at twice. The bone. Today, a bone is trash. It goes in the bin before the dishwasher even starts. Nobody thinks about it, because nobody has to. There is more meat at the store tomorrow, and the store is never more than a few minutes away. But in a home shaped by hard years, a bone was not trash. It was unfinished business. A mother who had learned to feed a family on one modest piece of meat did not see an ending when the plate was empty. She saw a beginning, because that bone still had heat in it, still had flavor in it, still had another meal hiding inside it, and she was not about to let that meal walk out the back door in a garbage pail. This was not about being desperate. It was about being awake to what food actually was. A single chicken, a modest roast, a few pounds of soup bones from the butcher for pennies, none of it lived one life in that kitchen. It lived 3, sometimes 4, meat for supper, broth for tomorrow, soup, or beans, or gravy, or dumplings, stretched from what most people today would call scraps. And underneath all of that, quietly forming in a cold pantry overnight, one more thing families did not waste either: the fat that rose to the top of the pot. Nobody wrote this down as a rule. Nobody called it a method. It was just what a careful home did, the same way it locked the door at night, or turned off a light in an empty room. And here is the part that is harder to sit with. This was not really about poverty. Plenty of families with more money than a Depression-era household still did the exact same thing, for the exact same reason. Because for most of American history, a bone with meat still clinging to it was never considered finished. It took a very short, very recent stretch of time, cheap meat, big refrigerators, drive-through windows, to convince people that a bone was garbage the moment the fork was set down. If you grew up with a mother or a grandmother who saved bones in the icebox, wrapped them in wax paper, and knew exactly what pot they were going into next, you were not watching something strange. You were watching the last living piece of a discipline that once kept entire families fed through winters, with no guarantee that next week would bring more meat at all. This is the story of what that discipline actually looked like, from the table, to the pot, to the second meal nobody expected, to the fat nobody threw away. And by the end of it, you may never look at your own kitchen garbage the same way again. The story did not start with the bone. It started earlier, with the meat itself, and with a kind of arithmetic that most modern grocery shopping has never required anyone to learn. A family in a working-class home in the 1930s did not walk into a butcher shop and ask what looked good. They walked in already knowing what they could spend, and the butcher, more often than not, already knew them by name. A few pounds of stewing meat. A modest cut, sometimes tougher than anyone would have chosen if money allowed for choosing. Maybe, on a good week, a small chicken. And on plenty of weeks, not meat at all in the form people picture today, but bones, soup bones, neck bones, a ham hock, the kind of cuts a modern shopper would walk straight past without a glance, because there is barely any meat on them at all. That was the point. A bone with a little meat on it was never bought for the meat. It was bought for what it could become. This is where the modern eye misunderstands the whole picture. Looking back at a Depression-era dinner table, it is tempting to see only lack, a small piece of meat, stretched thin, divided carefully among however many mouths were waiting. And the lack was real. Nobody is pretending a family of 6 splitting one modest chicken was living comfortably. But what made that home function was not the size of the meat, it was what happened to it after the meat was gone. Picture the table on a Sunday, because Sunday was often the day with the most on it. A chicken, roasted plain, maybe with onions and whatever root vegetables had survived the week in the cellar. The family ate. Plates were scraped, not because anyone was starving that particular evening, but because a plate left with food on it was a plate that had been planned badly. And when the meal was finished, when every person at that table had eaten enough, there was still a carcass sitting in the roasting pan. Bones, skin, small strings of meat too stubborn to come off with a fork, joints, cartilage. A modern kitchen looks at that carcass and sees the end of dinner. A Depression-era mother looked at that same carcass and saw Tuesday. She did not need a recipe for this. Nobody handed her a card with instructions. She had watched her own mother do it, most likely without a single word of explanation, the same way a child learns to lock a door or fold a towel, not because someone sat them down and taught it, but because they simply never saw it done any other way. The carcass went into a pot. Cold water was poured over it, enough to cover the bones completely, and then it went onto the back of the stove, where it would sit, not rushed, not checked every 5 minutes, just left, for hours. This is where the modern kitchen starts to lose the thread of the story, because the modern kitchen does not know how to wait. Everything about the way people cook today assumes speed, 15-minute meals, instant everything, a pot left simmering on the back burner for half a day, with nobody standing over it, sounds almost irresponsible to a modern ear, as if something might go wrong if you are not watching it every minute. But a Depression-era kitchen understood something that has almost entirely disappeared from the way people cook now. Some of the best things a kitchen can produce are not made quickly, they are made slowly, while the rest of the house goes on living around them. The pot did not demand attention. It asked for patience, and patience was something that household had in steady supply, because patience did not cost anything, and meat did. While that pot sat low and slow on the stove, the rest of the kitchen kept moving. There were dishes to wash, a floor to sweep, mending in a basket by the window, a younger child underfoot asking questions nobody had time to answer fully. The broth was not the center of the household's attention. It was working quietly in the background, the way so much of that household's survival worked. Not loudly, not with any fanfare, just steadily, in the corner, doing its job while everyone else did theirs. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something about the whole shape of that home. Nothing in that kitchen was allowed to be idle, not the leftover cabbage from last week, not the heel of a loaf of bread, and certainly not a pot of bones that, left alone for a few hours, would turn into something with real value, flavor, nourishment, a foundation for at least one more meal, sometimes two. By late afternoon, or sometimes the next morning if the pot had been left overnight in a cool spot, the water in that pot did not look like water anymore. It had gone rich and cloudy, deep in color, carrying the smell of the whole house with it. This was broth, or stock, if the family used that word, though plenty of homes never called it anything at all. It was just the pot, the thing simmering on the back of the stove that everybody understood without needing a name for it. Here is where the second meal actually began, not at the store, not with more money spent, but right there in that pot, made from what most homes today would have already thrown in the trash the night before. The broth was strained through a cloth or a fine sieve, sometimes just poured carefully to leave the bones and bits behind. What was left was liquid gold, in the most literal sense that word can be used in a kitchen that had almost none, and what that liquid became next depended entirely on what else the family had on hand that week, because a Depression-era home did not build its meals around a recipe, it built its meals around what was already there. If there were a few potatoes left, some carrots gone slightly soft, an onion or two, the broth became soup. Thin some weeks, thicker on others, but always warm, always filling, always stretching further than anyone outside that kitchen would have guessed possible. If there were dried beans soaking since the night before, the broth went into the pot with them, turning a modest bowl of beans into something with real body and real flavor, something that did not taste like poverty, even though poverty was exactly why it existed. If there was flour in the bin, that same broth might become the base for gravy, poured over sliced potatoes or torn bread to make a meal out of almost nothing but starch and patience. And on a week when the family had a little extra flour to spare, that broth might be brought to a low simmer, and small dumplings dropped in, one spoonful at a time, until what had started as a discarded carcass had become a full pot of chicken and dumplings, the kind of meal a family could sit down to and feel, for one evening, like they were doing just fine. Nobody at that table was thinking about how clever this was. Nobody said the word resourceful. It was Tuesday, and there was soup, and the soup came from Sunday's chicken, and that was simply how the week worked. But looking back at it now, from a kitchen where a container of broth cost several dollars, and a bag of frozen chicken bones goes straight into the trash, it is hard not to notice what that mother actually accomplished. She did not just avoid waste. She multiplied a single meal into 2, sometimes 3, without spending another cent, using nothing but water, time, and a knowledge of her own kitchen that nobody had to write down for her, because she had learned it the same way she learned to breathe. But the story of that pot was not finished when the soup was served. There was one more part to it, quieter, easier to miss, and in some ways, the clearest proof of just how little that household allowed to slip through its fingers. When the broth was made, or after the pot had cooked down and been strained, what often happened next was almost invisible if you were not looking for it. The broth, once it cooled, sitting in a bowl or a crock on the porch in winter, or down in the cool of the cellar when the weather allowed for it, would separate. A layer would rise slowly to the top and harden as it cooled. Pale, solid, unremarkable to look at. Fat. To a modern eye, this is the part of the story that lands hardest, because a modern kitchen treats fat almost the same way it treats bones, as something to be rinsed down the drain and forgotten. But in that house, a hardened layer of fat, sitting on top of a bowl of cooled broth, was not waste rising to the surface. It was another ingredient, patiently separating itself out and waiting to be used. That fat was skimmed off, carefully, and kept. It went into a can, or a jar near the stove, and it did not sit there for long, because it had work to do. A spoonful of it could start tomorrow's vegetables in the skillet instead of nothing at all. It could go into the bottom of a pan before frying up whatever bread or potatoes needed to be used before they turned. It could round out a pot of greens that would have otherwise tasted like nothing but boiled water. Nobody was buying oil every week to fry with, because the fat that came off Sunday's chicken had already been paid for. It simply had to be caught before it went down the drain instead of into the next meal. This is the part of the story that is easy to romanticize and easy to get wrong in the other direction, so it is worth being honest here. This was not a health trend. Nobody in that kitchen was saving fat because they believed it was good for them, and nobody was doing it because they enjoyed the process. They were doing it because throwing away something that could feed the family again was, to that household, close to unthinkable. It was not virtue, it was necessity that had, over years, hardened into habit, and the habit outlived the necessity by decades. That is really the heart of what made a Depression-era home function the way it did. It was not one clever trick with a chicken carcass. It was a mind that had been trained, meal after meal, year after year, to ask one question before anything went into the garbage: is this really finished? Most of the time, the honest answer was no. A heel of bread was not finished. It became the base of a bread pudding, or was torn into a pot of soup to thicken it. A rind of cheese was not finished. It went into the pot with the beans for flavor. Vegetable scraps, the ends of carrots, the outer leaves of cabbage, the tough parts of celery that most modern hands would toss without a second thought, those were not finished either. They went straight into that same simmering pot with the bones, adding whatever flavor they had left to give before the whole mixture was strained and the solids finally, truly, discarded. By the time that pot was actually emptied for good, it had usually given up everything it had. Meat, then broth, then a second meal, then fat for cooking, then whatever scraps had gone in along the way to round out the flavor. A single piece of meat, bought for pennies, had fed a family not once, but 3 or 4 separate times across the course of a week, and every one of those meals had felt, at the table, like an actual meal. Not a consolation, not a scrap dinner, soup that tasted rich, beans that tasted full, gravy that made plain potatoes feel like something worth sitting down for. This is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts becoming a little uncomfortable, because it raises a question that is not really about the 1930s at all. It is about right now, tonight, in kitchens that have more food in them than that household could have imagined, and less patience for using any of it fully. The modern home did not lose this habit all at once. Nobody made a decision, one day, to start throwing bones away instead of simmering them. It happened slowly, the way most of these things happen, one convenience at a time, one generation removed from watching a mother do it, until eventually, nobody in the house had ever actually seen it done, and so nobody thought to do it either. Cheap meat made the meat itself feel disposable. Big refrigerators meant nothing had to be used up before it spoiled, because there was always room for more. And at some point, a grocery store started selling broth in a box, pre-made, convenient, and the last real reason most families had to keep that pot on the back burner quietly disappeared. There is nothing wrong with buying broth in a carton. That is not the point of this story, and nobody watching this needs to feel guilty about a shelf of them in the pantry. The point is something a little different, and a little harder to say cleanly. The modern kitchen did not just stop making its own broth. It stopped seeing the carcass as something worth anything at all. It became garbage the moment the fork was set down, without a second thought, without a pot ever going onto the back burner to ask whether there might be one more meal hiding inside it. And that is really the loss this episode has been circling the whole time. It was never really about bones. It was about a way of looking at food, and by extension, a way of looking at what a family had, that assumed nothing was finished until it had truly given everything it had to give. A Depression-era mother did not need a movement or a philosophy to explain what she was doing. She was not trying to be admirable. She was trying to make sure her family ate on Tuesday the same way they had eaten on Sunday, without spending money she did not have. But what she built, almost by accident, meal after meal, was a kind of quiet intelligence, the kind that does not announce itself, does not ask for credit, and simply shows up again every time the plates are cleared and the pot goes back on the stove. If you want to bring even a small piece of that back into a kitchen today, it does not take much, and it does not require going without anything. The next time a roast chicken is finished at your table, the carcass does not have to go straight into the trash. It can go into a pot, or a bag in the freezer if there is no time that night, saved until there are enough bones and scraps to make it worth the effort. An onion skin here, a few carrot ends there, the way that Depression-era kitchen never let a single usable piece of anything slip past without asking first whether it still had something left to give. Cover it with water, let it sit low on the stove for a few hours while the rest of the evening goes on around it, and what comes out the other side will not taste like a box from the store. It will taste, in its own small way, like something that used to be common in almost every home in this country, before convenience quietly convinced people it was not worth the time. None of this was ever really about bones. It was about a household that had learned, out of necessity, not to let anything leave the kitchen with more left to give. A mother who looked at an empty plate and did not see an ending. A pot on the back burner that turned one modest piece of meat into 3 or 4 real meals, without a single extra cent spent. A layer of fat, skimmed and saved, because nothing that could feed the family again was allowed to go down the drain. They were not doing this because it was clever. They were doing it because the alternative, buying more meat that simply was not there to buy, was not an option most weeks. But somewhere in that necessity, without ever meaning to, they built something that modern convenience has quietly let most of us forget how to do. Look at what is already in the kitchen and ask, honestly, whether it is really finished. They had less, but they knew more. And a bone in a Depression-era kitchen was never really garbage. It was just a meal that hadn't happened yet. If this brought back the smell of a pot simmering on your mother's or grandmother's stove, subscribe to the Depression-era home, like this video, and tell us in the comments what your family never let go to waste. Was it the bones? The bread? The fat in a coffee can by the stove? Somebody out there might read your memory and remember their own kitchen for the first time in years. And if you know someone who still saves a carcass out of habit and has never quite been able to explain why, send them this one. They'll probably understand it faster than anyone.